Hello everyone, this is Julie. We are this week doing chapters 5 and 6 together. They are fairly straightforward. In fact, I would say they're incredibly straightforward. So we should be able to wheel through these fairly quickly with just one single presentation. And so hopefully that will help all of you. We will be covering language development, language diversity, and immigrant education, and then culture and diversity. So some of these topics we've already brushed on, and some of these we're covering for the first time. So good mix, and again, it should go fairly fast. So this week's objectives, these are the things that I am expecting you'll be able to do by the end of the unit. It's number 1, understand how language develops. 2, to be able to compare and contrast immigrant, refugees, and Generation 1.5 students, including their learning characteristics and needs. 3, to understand differences between English immersion, bilingual instruction, and sheltered instruction. 3, to be able to describe the meaning of culture and how cultural diversity in American schools today impacts learning and teaching. To be able to discuss what defines social class and socioeconomic status, including how SES or socioeconomic status differences relate to school achievement. To be able to explain how race, ethnicity, prejudice, discrimination, and stereotype threat may affect student learning. And then lastly, to be able to define multicultural education and apply research on diversity to student-friendly classrooms. So we won't be covering every single one of these today. However, we will be covering the majority of them and some of them at least partially. Okay, and let's start with the development of language. So there are some differences in how language is developed in different cultures. Well, actually, the language in other cultures differs, right? So that makes sense to us. Certainly we can gather that from our own experience. So cultures create words from the concepts that are important to them. So you can think about examples in contrast to English, which is probably the standard language for most of us in this course, compared to the development of language in, say, China or Japan, where they depend upon characters rather than words. So cultures create words for the concepts that are important to them. Children develop language as they build on other cognitive abilities by actively trying to make sense of what they hear. They're looking for patterns and making up rules. So we can think about this in terms of Piaget. It's the idea of the sensory motor, and so they are really keen on experiencing the world. So they're trying to figure things out by what they see and what they hear. Other considerations. There are built-in biases and rules that may limit the search and guide the pattern recognition. So what they hear and experience limits what they learn. So for example, some languages, there are differences in tone. So you might, if you live in one culture, you might experience a tone that other cultures don't experience. And again, there are some Asian cultures where that is true. So you actually, if you haven't heard that tone ever, you can't replicate it. So it becomes almost impossible for you, as someone coming from an outside culture, to actually learn the language, at least completely. So I hope that makes some sense. If not, please ask for clarification. And then lastly, reward and correction play a role in helping children learn correct language use, but children's thought processes are also very important. So what they think about in terms of language helps guide their learning as well. And so we can think about this again in terms of Piaget and Vygotsky and this idea of outside in or inside out. So is it something that they are developing from this cognitive level that they've met, which is what Piaget would say? So I've developed to this level and now I can learn. Or is it I've experienced this social interaction and now I can take it in, which is what Vygotsky would say. Okay, there are 4 distinct elements to language. One is phonology, which refers to the sounds of a language. So again, phonology would be something like that tone that I was referring to earlier. Semantics is the study of words and their meaning. Grammar refers to the rules used to describe the structure of a language, which involves syntax or rules that specify how words are combined to form sentences. And so we rely a lot on grammar when we are teaching older learners language. However, when we are thinking about language development from a child's point of view, it happens naturally, almost spontaneously. Again, it's that sensory motor development that's actually spurring the child to develop language. And you can think of a child who doesn't develop proper hearing, so they have an auditory issue, and then they will have a language issue because of that. Anyway, so grammar is this idea that there are rules. The rules themselves are syntax. The last element of language is pragmatics, which is how people use language to communicate effectively. So there are appropriate times for using certain types of language. Okay. So continuing on with the development of language, sounds and pronunciation. By age 5, most children have mastered the sounds of their native language. So again, we can only say most because certainly there are going to be children that have developmental issues for one reason or another. Some points on vocabulary and meaning. By age 6, most children understand up to 20,000 words and can use about 2,600. So they understand there's more what they call receptive language. So those are the words that they understand. And the 2,600 are the words that they can use, and those are expressive. So receptive, you receive it. Those skills are stronger than they're expressive. But as time goes on, obviously that's going to even out. So as cognitive abilities develop, children begin to understand words that express abstract ideas in hypothetical situations. So again, we can somewhat relate this back to this idea of Piaget's of operations, right? So as we develop, we are better able to understand more abstract concepts. And then a point on grammar and syntax. Initially, children may apply new rules that they picked up too widely. So we call this over-regularization. So they hear one thing and then they want to apply it to everything that they're going to say. So an example of this would be saying broked instead of broken. So English has a lot of variability in how the language is structured. And so this concept of over-regularization in our language becomes really important. In other languages, it may not play such a strong role. Okay, so again, pragmatics is a knowledge of how to use language. So when, where, and how, and to whom to speak. And then we have meta-linguistic awareness, and meta means thinking. This is going to come up a few more times within this course. So meta within this course is always thinking. So thinking about language, meta-linguistic awareness. So explicit understanding of language and how it works, and this starts to develop around age 5. Prior to that, the child just is not cognitively able to make this kind of thought process. So let's explore this quote. Children must learn to hear the differences in speech sounds and how to produce them. They must learn the meaning of words and rules for combining them into sentences, and they must learn effective ways to talk with others. So how could you take this quote and insert the vocabulary that you just learned into it? So we just explored a lot of different terms. We talked about over-regularization, we had pragmatics, we had syntax, we had grammar. And so how could you break this quote? And this is not, obviously, you can't respond to me here, but just think about this. How could I break this down into those words? And you can take almost every set of phrases and do that. So just something for you to consider in your own cognitive awareness. So how do I build from the words that have just been, the grammar that's been presented to me, or the words that have been presented to me, and actually build my understanding? So that's what this quote is about in terms of what I'm giving you. So take the quote and try to apply the terms that we have learned in these first few slides to it. Okay, continuing on with our exploration of the development of language, we want to explore this concept of emergent literacy. So there are two categories of skills that are important for learning reading. One is understanding sounds and codes. So decoding units of print into units of sound and units of sound into units of language. So inside out skills. So taking what's on in print and then thinking about sound and then sound into language. So it's like an interpretation. And if you think way back when, to when you were first learning how to read, and maybe you did see spot run, and it was, you're taking each, you read each word, and then finally, some magical day, everything starts to become sentences. So it's not just word, 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 it's this whole string of words has meaning. And so that's what we're talking about here. Oral language skills are understanding auditory derivations and placing them in correct conceptual and contextual framework. So outside in, so basically you can think about this as a reading hour. So I'm hearing somebody and now I'm hearing my teacher read to me, and this language that she's saying, I'm now processing and exploring and seeing a story. So ways of supporting emergent literacy are reading with children, retelling stories, and talking about them. So this talking about them, that's helping them develop cognitive strategies. So meta-linguistic awareness, how does language work? And limiting time spent watching television. So I hate to say this because I am a fan, but television itself is garbage. It's mind garbage. It's just, here's a thing, and then your mind just absorbs it, and it's not a real experience. So it doesn't have the depth and the complexity that we have when we actually experience something. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So I can show you a video of being on the beach, but it's not the same as being on the beach. You can even hear the sound of the waves, but you're not going to experience the heat of the sun. You're not going to feel the salt on your skin. And even though you may see somebody walking across the beach in the video, your reaction to it is going to be very different. So it's a false experience. So this idea of limiting the time spent on television is a good sound idea for everybody in the entire world, but difficult to follow. All right, so we're going to move into this diversity and language development, which leads us into dealing a little bit with culture and how we deal with language differences, which, as you should be aware, has become more and more of a concern within our society. Certainly we're having more and more Spanish language speakers, but in addition to that, we've had a number of immigrants from countries who speak French. So that has happened even here within the state of Iowa, which always seems like, oh, Iowa, everybody's white and everybody's middle class, and it's not true. So the reason why we cover this is because schools are becoming more and more diversified, which we have talked about a little bit already. But one of the things that we need to be aware of when we're dealing with this is this concept of language. So the language itself creates barriers to learning. And then there's a need for us to be able to be empathetic and understand contextually how somebody's approaching something. So that's where this diversity in language development really becomes important. So we're going to deal first with this idea of dual language learning. So children can learn 2 languages at once if they have adequate opportunities in both languages. So there are some children that live in an environment where grandpa and grandma live with them and they speak Mandarin. And mom and dad speak Mandarin, but they also speak English. And so that child could actually develop both languages at the same time. And so it's just this exposure. They have exposure to both languages, and so they learn both. And there are many cognitive advantages to learning more than one language. So it's really that you're capturing both sides of a coin, which is pretty incredible. While people at any age can learn a new language, the best time to learn accurate pronunciation is in early childhood. So like I said, if you haven't heard certain sounds by a certain point, it becomes really difficult for you to say them. People who can communicate in both a spoken and a signed language are in 2 different signed languages are considered bilingual, right? So we have this tendency to leave out sign as a language, but it is in fact its own language. What's interesting to me about sign language in general is that it is actually quite limited in terms of American Sign. The number of words that exist are significantly less than the number of words available in English language in general, like what we typically experience. So there are limitations for children and adults who speak primarily sign languages. So there are gaps in comprehension because of the diversity in the number of words. So smaller amount of words trying to express the same amount of ideas. Nonetheless, the point here is that we need to respect the fact that it is its own language. Okay, so let's talk about some milestones of language development and ways to encourage language development. So this is key. We want children to develop good language skills. Good language skills helps develop good reading skills, and that helps develop cognitive skills, which helps them accelerate achievement, which is what we want. We are teachers, or at least we hope to be, most of us. So in the age range of 2 to 3, the milestones are they can identify body parts. They call the self me instead of a name. They can combine nouns and words. They have a 450 word vocabulary, so this is their expressive. This is what they can say, but they understand far more. So their receptive language is higher. They can use short sentences. They can match 3 to 4 colors. They know the difference between big and little. They like to hear the same story repeated. So if you've ever been around a child and they'll come to you and they'll say, read Pat the Bunny, read the Pat the Bunny book. And even though you just read it to them 5 minutes ago, they want to hear it again. And they can form some plurals and answer where questions. So strategies to encourage development at this stage are to help the children listen and follow instruction by playing simple games. You can repeat new words over and over. You can describe what they are doing, planning, and thinking. So again, you're just helping them kind of develop meta-linguistic awareness. You can have the child deliver simple messages for you. So say this is one example of that. You can show you understand by answering, smiling, and nodding. And then you can expand on what the child says. So they have a limited ability in how they can express themselves. So they might say something like, more juice. And you would say, you want more juice? And so you're trying to, what you're really doing is you're scaffolding a little bit. So this is how you would actually want to say that. Yes, they're expressing the idea, but to develop the language skills, I'm going to say it in the way that would best express it in our society. In the age range of 3 to 4, some milestones are they can tell a story. They have a sentence length of about 4 to 5 words. They have a vocabulary of 1,000 words. They know last names, they know their last name, the name of their street, and usually several nursery rhymes, which is always fun. Some strategies to encourage development are to talk about how objects are the same or different. So you're helping them develop some concepts. You can help the child to tell stories using books and pictures. You can encourage play with other children. So anytime that they interact with other people, it spurs language development, right? So somebody says something in a different way, then they've got to think about that and process it, and they're building new synaptical connections. And then you can talk about places you've been or will be going. In the age range from 4 to 5, they have a sentence length of, again, 4 to 5 words. They can use the past tense. So now they're starting to understand time. They have a vocabulary of about 1,500 words. They can identify colors, shapes. They can ask many questions such as why and who. And the why game is really a fun one. If you've played this, why? Why? Why is the sky blue? And then you give them an answer. Why? 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 They want to know why. And sometimes you can answer, and sometimes you just have to say, I don't know. And that happens. But children are naturally curious, and that's why they're trying to figure out the world. Strategies to encourage development are to help the child sort objects and things. For example, things to eat and animals, are helping them categorize, you're helping them develop a schema. You can teach the child to use the phone. You can let the child plan activities. You can continue talking about a child's interests. So anything that they're interested in, they'll be more apt to continue to talk about. So that's why you would want to do that. And then let the child make up stories for you. From ages 5 to 6, they have a sentence length of 5 to 6 words, so getting a little bit longer. The average 6-year-old has a vocabulary of about 10,000 words, which is pretty good. They can define objects by their use. They know spatial relations such as on, top, and far. They know opposites. They know addresses. They use all types of sentences. Some strategies to encourage development are to praise the child when they talk about feelings, thoughts, hopes, and fears. So you're encouraging them to develop expressive language. So how do I feel? And that's a really important skill. To be able to tell somebody how you feel is difficult for even some adults, but starting at this age when you can really help them formulate a pattern for their life where they're able to say, this is how I feel, and they're encouraged to actually have feelings, to identify them and work through them, as opposed to swallowing them or just letting them control everything. Other strategies are to sing songs and rhymes and talk with them as you would an adult. So there's no reason at this point to continue with the baby talk. You want them to start developing real cognitive and language skills for adulthood. And then at every age, some strategies to encourage development, even for your 13-year-old. Listen and show your pleasure when the child talks to you. Carry on conversations with the child. Ask questions to get them to think and to talk. You can read books to the child every day, and they can increase in length as they develop. So there's certainly no reason why you can't read to a child a book that is beyond their reading level. That's actually a really good way to help them continue to develop their reading skills. Okay, so getting back to our conversation about diversity and language development. So key terms are bilingualism, which is the ability to speak 2 languages, which we had kind of brushed on before. So there are cultural differences in language, people that speak different languages, that makes sense. So cultural differences might interfere with developing academic English and content understanding. So where you're coming from and what language you speak may make it more difficult for you, for example, to understand scientific terms. So scientific terms tend to be built on Latin and Greek, and if you have had no exposure to a language that is related to that, that makes it more difficult. And then beliefs about learning are shaped by culture and previous experiences, and that can explain why English language learners may seem quiet and reluctant to speak in class. So they just may feel a little unsure. And so they don't want to put their foot out there, they don't want to jump into the pool. And so it's important that we encourage. So we need to concern ourselves with this idea of dialect. So dialect is this idea that within certain regions, there's variety in language. So there's a Southern dialect, there's a Midwestern dialect, there is an African American dialect. So a dialect is any variety of language spoken by a particular group. It can include variation in vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. So it differs by region and even within small distances or communities. So it is important that we respect these differences. However, if we just accept it completely, what we leave open for children with, well, let's just use Southern dialect, for example, we leave open a perception on the part of people that they will meet that they are not bright or they're not intelligent. So we do need to, while respecting the idea that there are dialects, we also need to encourage the child in terms of writing to be able to use proper English, right? So we can respect with still trying to help them build the skills that we're going to allow them to achieve. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. It is important to note that there is a thing called genderlect, which is the differences between how males and females speak. So males tend to be more direct, females tend to be more concerned about other people. That has a lot to do with how we're socialized. And even at the very beginning of a child's life, the way that people speak to a female child versus a male child tends to be different. And so it is interesting how those differences develop. And then accents, which is a different concept from dialect, it's pronunciation. So it's inflection, tone, or choice of words unique to an individual or group of individuals. So different term, somewhat related. Okay, so again, dialects in teaching. Teachers need to be sensitive to their own stereotypes about children who speak a different dialect. So again, important to respect, but also ensure comprehension by repeating instructions, asking students to paraphrase instructions and giving examples. Focus on understanding and accepting student language while teaching alternative forms of English used in formal writing and work settings. So we're still trying to help them develop the standardized English, but respecting the fact that there are differences between groups. We don't want to unvalidate somebody and what they've learned from their life. Okay. So again, as I pointed out, American society has changed a lot within the past 20, 30 years in terms of the number of bilingual students. So there are a lot of students from other countries in our schools for a number of different reasons. Usually what happens is you say English language learners or ESL. So English language learners are ELL. ESL is English as a second language. So English language learners has to do with the learners themselves. English as a second language is a concept. Small distinction, but it's there. All right, so I just wanted to make sure that everybody has a sound understanding of some of the vocabulary that surrounds teaching immigrant students. And so these are just definitions. Immigrants are people who voluntarily leave their country to become permanent citizens in a new place. Refugees are a special group of immigrants who also relocate voluntarily, but they're fleeing their home country because it is not safe. So reasons for becoming a refugee are typically political and often have to do with war. Okay, the third term that we need to be familiar with is Generation 1.5, and these are students whose characteristics, educational experiences, and language fluencies are somewhere in between students born in the United States and students who are recent immigrants. So they have qualities of both groups. Following up on that, Generation 1.5, they have some other characteristics of them. They have lived most of their lives in the US. The language at home may not be English, but they are often fluent in conversational English because they've been here so long, they've heard a lot of it. On the other hand, their academic English may not be well developed, so this is something that we need to help them with. And they tend to be ear learners, so they tend to learn by hearing what somebody is saying. And so we need to help them find other means of developing, in particular, this idea of academic English, because that's not always picked up by ear. Okay, approaches to teaching ESL or English as a second language. One is sheltered immersion or sheltered English immersion. This is where English is used as much as possible, and the student's level, so the student's developmental level, not developmental level, cognitive level, determines what and how much English is used. So the philosophical stance behind this is that valuable learning time is lost by teaching in a native language. So it's really saying, oh, we're just going to get right to the point. They're going to have to jump in, and that's that. With this idea of sheltered English immersion, language is structured for abilities. So again, it has to do with development, where they're at, so how much have they learned of English, and then visuals may be used as appropriate. On the other side, we have native language maintenance as bilingual immersion. So you have a mix of students who are learning in a second language with native speakers to achieve fluency in both. So hopefully most of you are aware of a program within your school district or former school district where this is happening. It would be, so you could have students who, I'm just going to use Dubuque because I know that one of my nephews is at a school where this happens. So he is from Dubuque. He goes to a school where there are like 3 different paths. One is Spanish, one is Croatian, and then maybe Vietnamese is the third one. But his parents placed him in a program where the classes are taught in both English and Croatian. So he's learning both. And that's how that works. So it's this idea of bilingual immersion. So the philosophical stance behind that is deep learning in one language supports deep learning in the other. And if we don't do this, cultures may be devalued. Both languages are used, and visuals may be used as appropriate. So this allows both the native English speaker and the immigrant to learn both languages, which is really pretty cool. So let's explore some profiles of English language learners. So ELL. The first one is balanced bilinguals. They can speak, read, and write well in their first language and in English. Monolingual or literate students are literate in their native language but speak limited English. And some of this has to do with timing. So how long have they been in the United States and when did they come? And then monolingual and pre-literate students may not read or write in their native language, or they may have very limited literacy skills. So again, timing, educational level, opportunities for education may have an impact on that. And then lastly, limited bilingual are students that can converse well in both languages, but for some reason have trouble learning academically. So they haven't picked up the academic skills, but they have some fairly decent expressive language. Okay, so this allows us to move on into chapter 6, which is culture and diversity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I do have a few slides to share with you. Okay. So, American cultural diversity. So culture is the knowledge, skills, rules, norms, practices, traditions, self-definitions, institutions, language, and values, etc., that guide the beliefs and behavior of members of a group. Our society includes many different cultures and subcultures. And I think that this picture on the left, the cultural iceberg, really helps us think about how culture is largely unseen. So it's easy to see customs, mores, courtesies, but it's difficult to see people's values, priorities, and assumptions. So what this points out to you, or should be pointing out to you, is that we need to think carefully about other people's cultures and how that influences their behavior, and not just impose our own views on other people. So we need to be giving careful consideration to other people. That being said, teach individual students, not ethnicity. So it has to do with learning about your students, right? Everybody deserves respect as an individual. Not, I have a group of students who are Croatian and this is how I treat them and they're all the same. It doesn't work like that. Every student is an individual. Every student has different developmental capacities, different intelligences, different ways of understanding and processing. And so we need to be considering all of these things, which is what makes teaching so difficult and challenging, but also wonderful. Okay. Sorry about that. Didn't realize it was going to do that. So let's talk about socioeconomic status, or SES. It comes up a lot within education. And it's really this idea that within a society, within a society, there are different levels of income. And those different levels of income are tied to different experiences. So there's upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class. Within the upper class, you have the upper, and then the upper. And these are people with money, quite a bit of money, as you can see from the income levels listed here. So 500,000 and above, the top 1% of earners in the United States. They tend to come from old money, or they have family money. They make their money from investments. People within this group tend to have their children educated through tutors. They attend prestigious private schools and colleges, so they might go to Exeter and then go to Harvard. So they go to a top boarding school, and then they go to Harvard, and they have these sheltered lives, and they don't see the rest of us, basically. Home ownership, they might have several homes. They would have health coverage. They have live in exclusive neighborhoods. They can easily afford college. They also have normally national, state, and political power. So they have money. Money equates with political power. That's an unfortunate truth of the society that we live in. The upper class, they make 200 to maybe 500,000, still a large amount of money. They tend to work in corporate America. They tend to be professionals. They earn their income as opposed to just living off investments. Again, prestigious colleges and grad schools. They have at least one home. They have health coverage, exclusive neighborhood. They can still afford college and national, state, and local power. Middle class, two groups here. Those making 114 to 200,000 is half of this. So upper middle class, and then you have lower middle class, which is 48,000 to 114,000. They tend to be white collar or skilled blue collar. So white collar is typically people that work in an office. They may be professionals. Education is high school, college, or professional school. They usually own a home, usually have health coverage. They live in a comfortable neighborhood. They may or usually be able to afford college, and then they have some state or local political power. Working class, they would earn between 27 and 48,000. They are blue collar. They have a high school education. Half of them own, half of them don't. They may have some health coverage. It depends. Modest neighborhood. They seldom afford college. This is not normally a priority. If, for example, you're making 48,000 and you have two kids, it's not a great amount of money. You might be doing okay, but there's not a lot extra. And then political power is limited. The lower class, which basically would be people living in poverty, would be earning below 27,000. They would be working minimum wage, unskilled labor, so might be working at McDonald's with 3 kids. Generally have high school education or less. They're renting. They can't afford to make the down payment to own their own home. It's uncommon for them to have health coverage. So again, if you're trying to cover expenses for children and you're making minimum wage, it's just impossible to do. They tend to live in deteriorating neighborhoods. It's uncommon for them to afford college, clearly. Don't have any money, so how are you going to pay for that? And they have little, if any, political power. Okay, so why be concerned with socioeconomic status if all we're concerned about is teaching? Well, there is a correlation. There's a positive correlation between the SCS and achievement. So the more money you make, the more you achieve. So the better you do in school. That's basically how it boils down. And there are some related influences. So there are some reasons why this happens. One is if you're poor, it's harder to access quality health care. There are lower expectations. And unfortunately, sometimes teachers play into this. So if a child is poor, then we think they can't do something, but that may not be true at all. It's just something that we are imposing. Learned helplessness. So what happens, and we can think about this in terms of generativity versus stagnation from Erickson. What can happen is somebody with very low income may feel completely unempowered within their life. So I can't do anything to get out of this situation. So you have this feeling of learned helplessness. I'm not able. And so children see that. They see that modeled to them, and that's what they take on. So there's this idea of learned helplessness can play into this correlation between socioeconomic status and achievement. Peer influence and resistance cultures. So it's this idea of, well, I live in just forgot the word that I wanted to use. I live in Cabrini Green, which is a housing development for the poor, right? So I live in Cabrini Green, and everybody I know is poor, and the upper class takes advantage of us. They're keeping us down. And so that kind of belief system, it becomes a little bit of a cycle. So it's you believe it to be true, and then you kind of take on the characteristics of that culture, and that resistance prevents you from going farther. And there's a lot that goes into it, and it's really complicated, but just to kind of give you a gist of how that might work. There's this idea of tracking. And so what happens if you're coming from a family where your parents don't have a lot of education and they're working really hard to make the money that they do, and maybe they're working 2 or 3 jobs and they don't have the time to spend with you to read the stories, then maybe you walk into kindergarten and you haven't learned to read yet, but Bonnie, Tommy, and Johnny come from families where mom is at home all day and she taught us how to read. And so you get put into that lower level reading group, and that's where you stay. So tracking has an influence on SES and achievement as well. Child rearing styles. So whether your parents are authoritarian, authoritative, or permissive can have an influence. I haven't looked at the studies on this. I am assuming that where this is coming from is the belief that those in the lower socioeconomic statuses would have leaned towards permissive or neglected styles of parenting. I have no stats to back that up. That is something that came from the textbook, so and then home environment and resources, and we've really kind of brushed on all of those and working through the different bullets. So I just wanted to point out real quick, is this achievement gap starts early. So 525 from children in welfare families versus 1,116 words for children in professional families. And really what that boils down to is the children in the welfare families tend to come from families that don't have a lot of education. And so the parents themselves just don't have huge amounts of words to draw from. And so that becomes a limitation, and also probably not enough time to spend with their children, depending. And again, none of these are blanket statements. None of them are true, absolutely. This is based on some quantitative analysis of correlation. So this is what we've seen, and it makes some sense, but there are always situations where it's not true. So take it with a grain of salt, but kind of consider them to be general patterns. And that concludes chapters 5 and 6. Thanks.